These are, in some respects, very difficult readings, especially if we tend to think of Jesus as the Prince of Peace, Jesus who comes bringing good news, Jesus whom at least ordinary people loved. Now, obviously, powerful people had a little issue, shall we say, with the Lord. But ordinary folks loved Jesus because he did so many wonderful things. As the Acts of the Apostles says, he went about doing good, healing and preaching the good news. So what are we to make of these sayings attributed to Jesus, saying, I've come to establish not peace, but division, and that households will be divided one against the other, a father against a son, a mother against a daughter, and so forth and so on. I want to suggest to you that at least one of the things that we need to consider, and it's a difficult thing to consider, particularly for Americans, and perhaps particularly people who have such distinguished heritage as you obviously do, otherwise you would not be here at WashU, and who have such a wonderful future ahead of you, precisely because you have come to Washington University. And that is this, that people have paid extraordinary prices for the faith that we practice today. Obviously, Jesus did. He died. But he was not the only one, of course. One way to look at the earliest history of the church, and in the interests of full disclosure, this is what I do for a living. I think about the New Testament and occasionally write articles that, well, frankly, no one reads, but that's another issue altogether. But one way to look at the experience of these earliest followers of Jesus is to see it as an experience of suffering and ultimately an experience of failure. They died. They died violently. They died publicly. They died hated by the majority of the population of the cities in which they met their death. They died in many cases for entertainment, brought out to battle against gladiators who were better armed than they themselves were, brought out to struggle ad bestiam, to struggle with lions brought in from Africa. And so ordinary people in the empire 2,000 years ago thought of Christians as weird, as eccentric, as fools in many respects. Why would one be willing to die, especially for one who died himself? It looked like a religion of utter destruction. Now, we, of course, are insiders. We know that the faith to which we are heir is not a religion of destruction, that it is the good news. It is, as we say, the gospel of life. A life that triumphs over destruction. A life in which good comes out of evil. But the reason, I think, that we can so blithely profess that faith in a gospel of life is because other people were willing to die. Other people were willing to suffer. Other people were willing to undergo shame so that we, 2,000 years ago, can worship in a handsome building like this and contemplate with gratitude where we have come from and where we're going. I think at the very least, then, this gospel urges us against a certain smugness. And I think that's always the problem when you come from distinguished parentage and your teeth have been straightened and your muscles have been built up and your SAT scores are high, or, for those of you in grad school, your GRE scores are high, I think it's easy to be smug about all of that and to think of the good things that have come to us and the good things that will come to us as our entitlement. And in that respect, the first reading reminds us that nothing really is our entitlement. Jeremiah was a lot like us. He came from distinguished parentage, really one of the best families in his village of Anatoth. He was an aristocrat, and he attended, if you will, the Israelite, or technically Judean, equivalent of Washington University. He didn't go to that blue-collar college across town on the corner of Lindell and Grand. He lived in Clayton, as it were. Okay? He was gentle, well-born, well-educated, accustomed, frankly, to the finest things in life. Now, he was also faithful, not just a priest, but also a prophet. And he called them like he saw them. And what he called was this, that the difficulties that Jerusalem endured, they were being warred against by the Babylonians, were in fact, as Jeremiah saw it, God's punishment precisely for being smug, precisely for being possessed by a sense of entitlement. We are the chosen people. We are the ones God loves best. And Jeremiah said, well, yes, but those whom God loves, God also chastens, and so get ready to be spanked. Now that trivializes, in some respects, the experience of Jerusalem. It was destroyed. The walls were pulled down. The children were caught up by their heels, having their heads dashed against a stone. It was one of the earliest examples in written history of what we have come to recognize as ethnic cleansing. And Jeremiah said, and this is the hard saying, that all of that was the will of God. So, in that first reading, the princes of Jerusalem rose up against this well-born, well-spoken prophet and cast him into a muddy cistern. And were it not for the Ebed-Melech, the servant of the king, this outsider, this Ethiopian, Jeremiah would have died in the mire. The outsider, of course, rescued him. Jeremiah becomes, for Jesus some 600 years later, a kind of model of fidelity. Jesus knew, thanks to the example of Jeremiah, that one must be faithful no matter what the cost, even if that cost included, as it did for Jesus, execution. As I say, that is hard for us to understand, since no one will come after us for having gathered together this morning. No one will arrest us for our faith in our God. In fact, we'll get a tax deduction for whatever it is we contribute come the offertory collection, provided, of course, you can document your offerings. I'm not a tax attorney, but some of my best friends are. The author of the letter to the Hebrews, though, reminds his correspondents that, you haven't had to suffer. That, in fact, you live comfortable lives. And so he uses a metaphor I think that some of us, I certainly can relate to. He uses the athletic metaphor. specifically the metaphor of running. And he said, all right, you're not going to suffer, but at least you can think of your life in God as a kind of contest, a kind of athletic event in which you race toward a goal. Now, I run daily in my neighborhood. I can't always say that I keep Jesus as my goal. Sometimes it's just a glass of cool water that I know awaits me when I get back home again, that enables me to finish the race. As long as I keep running, I'll get home sooner, I'll drink the water faster. But we might think of our own experience, and those of you who are still in school, I think, can relate to this. You think of your curriculum, whether in undergraduate school or graduate school, as a kind of race. Sometimes it's an obstacle race. Yes, I know. And people like me, professors, place obstacles in front of people like you, hurdles, perhaps, we might think of them, as a way for you to improve your leap, as it were. But the fact remains, it's not really suffering. It's just study. And that is a good thing. That is the occupation of people who, in fact, come from distinguished families and have distinguished futures ahead of them. So what do? We who do not suffer. As I say, at the very least, we can be grateful to that cloud of witnesses that surrounds us whenever we worship, many of whom did pay the ultimate price for their faith. Because they died, we live. Because Jesus died, we live. At the very least, we can be grateful.